Cool.
All right, welcome everyone to This is BlackLight Live, sort of, BlackLight Live recorded. This is Lucianne Walkowicz, Renee Logic, and Brian Nord discussing This is BlackLight's summary of work that we've done in the past about what the Black experiences are in America. So if you're not familiar with This is BlackLight, go to our very first post from 2017 and check out what the purpose of this is. The basic idea is, for those not familiar, how do you learn something? And when you learn something about the Black experiences in America, what does that inspire you to do to affect change in racial inequity and injustice in America? And so this conversation is us reflecting on some questions that we distilled from what we've written over the years and what has been turned into a zine, and just having a conversation to think about what our actions are, what they have been in the past, and what we can do in the future to make some change.
Yeah,
Where should we start with our questions?
Sorry, Renee, did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say, this is the Get Off the Couch edition.
Yes. Yeah, so if you go to the website, you'll notice that there are a couple of recent posts, in addition to all of the ones that we've written in the past, that we're trying to consolidate everything together to serve as teaching tools and reading groups or reading group oriented materials. And all of those sort of stand alone, but they also have links to the longer articles. So if you go to the website and you're like, wow, these people have been doing a lot of posting for the past 3 years, where do I start? Hopefully the zines will give you an idea. And yeah, what we wanted to do with this was to model the kinds of discussions that we're hoping that people will have with one another. So you're seeing us do it, you can do it at home.
Exactly. And as you see us do it, like we're gonna mess up here. So this is not about being perfect. This is about having the conversation and just getting that started.
And one of the cool things we hope with the zine is that it's also something that's tangible, right? You can get out of your computer, you can get off your laptop, you can take your phone into a setting, you can print these out and actually just use them as starting boards for discussions, and also a bit of a call to more direct action and not just thinking, because we all want to learn, we all want to improve our understanding of issues of around racism and systemic discrimination. But if we only learn and don't do anything to change, then what are we doing?
Cool. So having given everybody that intro, where would you all like to start? This first zine, for folks who maybe haven't seen it, is called Numbers Too Big to Manipulate, A Force Too Big to Ignore. And it centers around both voting and voting access and voting rights, and also around protest. So we have lots of questions in there. We can start anywhere. Y'all?
So I wanted to actually ask you guys about a conversation I had in a cab. I was in Chicago. I was taking a cab to the airport, and I had a conversation with the Uber driver. And we were talking about voting. We were talking about the elections. And I was asking her, just what she thought. And she said, look, I've been kind of beaten up mentally in the last 4 years. I think it just makes sense if I just check out. But she was a woman of color, and we were talking about how you balance the anger and the idea of protesting by not showing up versus voting and making sure other people can vote. And I'm interested in what you guys think as people in the US right now. How do we have that conversation?
Ooh, that's a good one. Brian, do you have initial thoughts that you want to share?
I think that everyone's strategy for both creating change or for coping, which maybe are both, which are part of the same, two sides of the same coin. I want to respect everyone's choices there. I may have disagreements about whether people check out or not. I think I was thinking about where this person's potentially coming from, and as I started thinking about that, I wanted to ask what their goals are. So, if you're protesting the system by not participating, then I think a potential strategy that underlies that is, this shit needs to be burned down, needs to be done. Like, if you if you don't believe in the system enough to do something, then I think that maybe says that you think that the system is bad enough that it should just go away. So if that's your strategy, then I'll say, okay, if that's your strategy, that's what you're going for, and I appreciate it from that perspective. But I don't think that we should be under. I don't think we should fool ourselves that by protesting that engages change within the system that currently exists, or protesting, sorry, by not showing up to vote.
Yeah, I hear that. I also think the choice can be something in between those two kind of polar ends, in that, like for me, like I don't like believe in the system. However, I think that what like the early 2000s taught me is that, and I'll paraphrase from Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, who says this a lot, is that voting really affects the conditions that you organize in. And while I have criticisms of sort of like the broader workings and of basically everyone who's ever held a political office, I do recognize that there are conditions under which change is more possible than not. And for me, like participating in voting is about setting those conditions to be more favorable for what I want to do. So it's not even necessarily that you really need to like believe one way or another. I think the sort of like tendency to be very all or nothing with it hurts us, in that everything is like compromised and hopelessly entangled, but that's not an excuse for not doing something, right? So what I liked about this zine that we put together is that it kind of presents both participating in electoral politics and the sort of like protest side of things, whatever that looks like for you. Like your cab driver, Renee, might have a very different orientation towards it than I do. I don't know. But I think that it can look like a lot of things. It can look like checking out. It can look like participating in ways that are like within your boundaries. It can just look like a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I appreciate that nuance. I mean, I guess it's more than nuance. It's really just laying out the spectrum, and that the reason, yeah, it's not checking in or checking out. It's basically how you participate, because you're sort of participating no matter what you do. And yeah, I think it is important to really clarify that we're not voting for heroes. We're not voting for like the change that is going to like make all future change not necessary. It's an infinitely long game, and so we're when we vote, we're voting for what the circumstances are that we're going to do the next actions in, like you said.
I really love what you were saying about just now about like what is your goal, or what is the thing you're working towards. I was recently in an exhibition of like items from the apartheid era, and particularly around Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. And just yesterday was the 30-year anniversary of his release from prison and the unbanning of the ANC. But what I didn't realize is that, which I found from this museum, is that the South African government was under a lot of pressure near the end of apartheid, and particularly because of their treatment of prisoners. And so they offered him a release, an early release from prison, or just a release, right? They didn't know when he was going to be released. They offered him a release from prison like 2 or 3 years before he actually ended up being released. But it was conditional on him. It was like a pardon, not an acknowledgement that he'd done nothing wrong. And he refused. He said, I refuse. If you release me, it's because I am innocent, not because I have good behavior. And I thought that was so interesting, where he was like, what is my goal? My goal is to protest this regime. It's not actually my personal freedom. It's the global picture, which is like, I mean, that's a big deal. And I'm not saying we should ask people to do that, but I really like that thought of what is the goal? If the goal is just to myself protest, or is there a way I can protest in a group action or make change, or, in all of these things, whatever it looks like for you, how can I facilitate the goal that I want?
Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, I did not know that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, he was, amazing.
Yeah, I hear he's a great guy. I've heard a little bit about.
Given that we actually talked about this a little bit on the zine, I wonder, like, should we talk a little bit about our discussion in the zine about MLK and the narrative that surrounds him, given of the protest?
Yeah. So I had a good time making the sort of end pages of the zine. I actually am not totally sure if I pointed it out to you, but I put one of those like MLK Jr. like quotes about civility on the White House lawn. If you look carefully at the picture that's in the backyard, that's in the backyard, that's in the back pages of the zine, which I did in part because those like, particularly those signs that have these like MLK quotes that are all the very like soft and fuzzy ones about like loving each other and like how like you can only like fight darkness with light. I'm also like doing a brutal job of paraphrasing MLK right now. But those popped up like all over Capitol Hill. And so for those who may not know me, like I was in residence at the Library of Congress at the time, and I would like walk through the neighborhood sometimes to, get a breath of air or whatever. And they were all over the place. And I used to think about them a lot, particularly in the context of like conversations that are ongoing about civility or calls for civility as a way of silencing people. And how these lawn signs were really like silencing the like radical person that MLK Jr. was, while using his words to do it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the grossest way that I see the system, whether it's through orchestration or through something organic, really try to undercut a community or a people that is seeking freedom. Like to me, it's a very, like, there's nothing really nuanced about it in that sense. Like it's a very obvious tactic or strategy that either is like, yeah, done on purpose or just erupts, that people take words and you move them around to suit your own needs well, and fool the people who are not as familiar with the situation or the history. So yeah, I think I see a lot of different people use it. I see white people use it to try to quiet down Black people, and I also see Black people use it to try to in some senses play it safe. And yeah, this kind of propaganda, I think is something that we should be actively pushing back against.
And do you think the same thing will happen with Black Lives Matter in 30 years?
I think it depends on what we do. Like I think what's happened is that we have all participated in in some senses, the over focus on a single Black male leader in the community. And we have all permitted all these words to be decontextualized. And I think it's a group, it's a countrywide, a society-wide effort to keep Black Lives Matter and other groups and their words, like keep them relevant and keep them contextualized.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, as you were pointing this out, Lucienne, I was thinking, like, has anyone compiled a list of the non-milk toast or non-milk toast interpretable statements from MLK? Has anyone ever like listed his more, what would it be called? Yeah, his more dangerous,
fiery
commentary. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's everything except for the things you see on lawn signs. Yeah, it's interesting to think about in the context of like the way that like what do I want to call this? Like I guess just like white supremacist capitalism sort of like eats the discourse and turns it into a product. Like Renee, your comment about Black Lives Matter, like what Black Lives Matter is I think is unco-optable. But I will say that, you know, we have seen like an explosion of like t-shirts, stickers, you know, like a thing you can make your Facebook icon, some of which I think is genuine support. But I also see those things and wonder like, well, did you ever, you know, like show up to a march, or like what is the action that accompanies this sort of like virtue signaling via like usually the like acquisition of products, right? Again, when I was living in DC, there was like this store that opened up on 14th Northwest, which is like used to like is huge, like super hyper gentrified, that is all like boutiques and, you know, like houseware stores. And it was like entirely devoted to all of the social justice like t-shirts and swag that get marketed to me on Instagram.
Wow.
And I was like, wow,
Yeah, and then you think, well, like, who's actually making those? And, you know, if you're supporting like a collective who are selling the shirts for their cause, great. But if you're supporting some random person who just thinks that these slogans are valuable now, it's like,
yeah. That idea of the passive consumption, the sort of denaturing and trivializing the thing that you're consuming, I think is that part of the process. I think that is a significant part of that process.
Well, which is why we have tried to move this towards people embracing action, because, you know, I think that we, in creating the resource that we have on, you know, This is BlackLight, the worry that I know we always talk about, right, is that people are like receiving this in their newsletter, in their inbox, whatever, and being like, yes, excellent
I understand
points.
now.
yeah.
So
what if you think in your week or whatever ahead, like, we've sort of talked about a roadmap of things to do to get off the couch, to get more active. Have you found anything in particular that resonated for you either in the last week or something that you're definitely planning to do this week?
I don't know if it's something that I am personally going to do in the next week or so, but it depends on when the thing happens to react to. But I was just thinking, because in the zine we have something about we talk about how protest is complementary to voting, and we talk about how like the sort of the meaning of protest and what it where it really has an effect. And, you know, I hear around me, especially a lot of white people, when it happens, like when there were protests in Chicago a few years ago for Laquan McDonald, people were annoyed that it was getting in the way of their Christmas shopping. And so something that I think people can do is, when there's a protest happening, figure out what it's about. And if you understand it, you know, talk to the people around you who are bothered by it, and just say, hey, you know, think about it. You can't go Christmas shopping, but, you know, an entire city's worth of people have been oppressed for years and they've been killed. Maybe, you know, maybe there's a balance there. Maybe, you know, maybe you can understand what that action is about. So I think just talking to somebody next to you in a moment where they're upset about something like that can, you know, it can share with them potentially in a moment where they're vulnerable, and maybe even listening to change their mind. It can say, okay, think about this for a second, or maybe can interrupt their disappointment or their anger.
Yeah, I mean, and that idea of, we get so focused on being whatever, some productive member of society, whatever that means, whether you're just like going to work or doing your thing, and saying, like, reminding both yourself and others of the importance of this action, even if it is small in time, and not just saying, well, it's not going to matter, it's like a 2-hour thing or whatever, it's not going to matter if I go, no one's going to notice them there, blah blah blah. And actually saying, well, either, as you said, either I can try and be a bit of a firewall to other people's frustration and discomfort, if I can't go there myself, or actually think of, like, you know what, let me drop that afternoon telecon or that lunch meeting and actually, like, go. I think that's something that I've been really bad at, actually, is like, there'll be a protest and I say to myself, oh, it was great, but I didn't have enough time to plan for it. You know, like, I wish it was scheduled more. And you're like, oh, cool. Great. No, that collective action is happening on your time scale. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, my feelings towards protest in the sense of like marching in the streets are complicated and change pretty often. You know, I in like Iraq War days, I spent a lot of time and effort organizing some of the really big protests in Seattle at the time that when I was living there. And then I became very unenamored of protesting for a long time, and sort of did the thing where I checked out. And, you know, really have re-entered it over the past several years, and found that like my feelings about it change a lot. I was heavily influenced by Michael White's End of Protest, which talks about sort of how marches are really more like parades in many cases now. They're not actually like threatening power structures.
That's been co-opted just like MLK has, right? Like the way that we have to flow through a city to have a protest. Like, yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I saw that parallel.
No, it's very true. And I think it also heavily depends on like whose protest it is, right? Like the Juan McDonald protests were pretty different than like the Women's March, to put it super understatement. So, you know, like I have recently, to return to your question, Renee, about like what action has sort of come to mind, you know, like I recently have sort of re-warmed up to going to marches or rallies, just because I think that they can be an important way of like refilling our energy as organizers. I think, you know, like the day after the impeachment verdict came back, there was a rally organized here that was, you know, relatively small. Things that are not planned ages ahead of time tend to be, but relatively small, where they had like a sort of like mock trial, since no real trial with like witnesses and stuff. And, you know, there weren't a ton of people there, but we like gathered and, you know, had signs and marched over to, you know, whose tower. And to me, you know, I similarly, Renee, had this like, oh, I don't really have time. I'm so tired, you know, like my body hurts. And I just went anyway. And I was like, I'm just going to go for a while. And, you know, like if I have to leave before the end, then that's what has to happen. But it felt good to remember that there were other people who were like-minded and who were thinking about those things. And like, it's not that action was intended necessarily. It's like not going to like topple everything that is wrong. But it's a reminder that there are people who see that there's something wrong.
And it's also sort of part of embedding you in something bigger than yourself, whether that thing is tearing down the system or changing the system or whatever, but it's sort of at least for me, it gives you some hope in action that, whatever that hope means and whatever that action means, but rather than inwardly focusing and just being like, things are really bad.
Because generating change in most cases, like in what we're talking about, this is a coalition-based effort. Like this is a community-based effort. It is very rare that one individual is going to like, you know, drive, you know, decades of change by themselves. And I think it's important to remember that. And then it's important to, I think about building your, you know, connecting to a coalition or to a community that is working on change. It's there are various levels of difficulty in it, but you know, the earlier you start, the easier it is. So you can gradually, you know, begin to work with people and learn how this change works. You don't have to do it by yourself. You don't have to like, you know, figure everything out. There's a lot to learn, and people who are driven to make change and people who know how to build coalitions, like that's what they do, and they want you to be a part of that. And so I've learned the most just, you know, showing up and interacting with people and saying, okay, you know, I'm gonna learn from you about how to do this.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you guys. So when we were thinking about like action and stuff, I sometimes think to myself, maybe this is a bias as scientists or something. We think like, I want to make sure that I'm like the most effective, whatever that means. And sometimes I think that can mean if I'm not going to be an expert at this thing I'm going to do, then I'm not going to try because, you know, I don't want to, I don't know, make a fool out of myself or not be useful. And sometimes I think like, yeah, like folding pamphlets or handing out buttons or like doing a job that someone just says, I need this task, I need a body to do something. If you are able-bodied and can do that, for me at least, it's great to realize that we don't always have to be the organizer. We can be the person who is, you know, enabling something under someone else's leadership too.
Yeah, I mean, we got a totally unqualified person in the White House. You can do anything you want. No, I mean, in all seriousness, like the thing to remember, and this is like kind of bridges, I think, off of what you just said, Brian, too, is that like a lot of, you know, like when you look to people who really are like very competent or are longtime organizers, like, and you're like, well, that's what you do. That's not always what they did. In most cases, like most people just showed up to a thing and folded the pamphlets, you know, and it can be very daunting to do that. But I think that, you know, it's something that I'm thinking about a lot in this context is like in-person meetings, you know, like I think the three of us being astronomers, we're used to having like a community that is very dispersed, like really all over the world, you know, that we like connect with a lot virtually, like we are right now. And I think that can be effective. But I really I find myself being very hungry for that sort of local connection. So like an action that I am looking forward to taking, or a couple actions that I'm looking forward to taking coming up soon here is that we have a group at my work that is going to be working through Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy. So if you're not familiar with the book, it's been out as like a workbook for a couple of years and now it's been published. And so you can get it more easily through your sort of favorite book getting place. But it contains 28 days of exercises. So we're going to be working through it as a group. And I'm looking forward to doing that like in person with other humans. And there's also a book club that I'm going to go to that's about transformative justice that I am looking forward to as well.
That's great.
I'm remembering something that Lucienne said I don't know when it was within the last few years. We were riffing and we were talking about this idea of, you know, like Renee said, how do you make the most change happen? A lot of people think they want to be there in that moment where you're the Jenga piece that like does something. And I think it's taken me a while to, you know, really sit with it and be able to remember on call that big change is a result of a long grind. And you don't get to just grind at the end and then something happens. You're grinding for a long time. And so folding pamphlets and taking phone calls, that's part of the grind, and that means something. So I think, you know, it's important for me to remember that you know, I don't come in at the last minute and score the final touchdown. I want to be pushing on the line the whole time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if I just went to a mirror lab, you know, in Arizona and looked at them polishing like a mirror for one of the big telescopes, and they have to polish the mirror super slowly for like 8 days or something ridiculous. And if you do it right in one go, you'll either crack the mirror or you'll make a big hole. And I also like that analogy too. But, you know, something that really reminded me, as, you know, some of the people who are reading the zine, who are reading Mrs. BlackLight, are white people who are trying to be like allies, learn things, whatever. But of course, that directly goes in conflict with this whole must do it all, must be the leader, must be the Jenga piece that solves the whole puzzle, right? And I think there's so many interesting things to learn about. Yeah, maybe you're only ever going to be doing pamphlets forever. Maybe you're never going to go to the leadership position because it's also not your role. And realizing that it doesn't have to be, I'll work my way up this protest organization or whatever. Like it can just be sometimes people need action.
Yeah. I just want to point out, you know, because we're kind of talking about it without articulating it, that like that, the orientation that we're talking about of like being like, the nobody's going to know that I was here at this march or rally or whatever, or like, I'm going to like work my way up into leadership. These are very hierarchical and like fundamentally like capitalistic, individualistic society orientations towards those goals, right? So like, what is your goal? And going back to what Brian articulated at the beginning of this call is to think about, you know, like your goal is not right to be noticed, hopefully. You know, hopefully your goal is to make change. And this is a trap that I think a lot of white people who want to be allies fall into, is that they inadvertently set, and sometimes advertently, center themselves in the work. And it is personal work in the sense that like the work that you have to do internally to make yourself useful is individualistic. But ultimately, like you, a white person cannot be at the center of the struggle for Black liberation, or because that is the whole problem.
No, I really like that idea that it's like, yes, do the personal work, do the inward work, and then don't do the outward, you know, glory march on your own, because
yeah, but also don't just do the inward work, right? The inward work is very safe. No one can see you in there. You can't screw up.
I can use all the right words. And
I guess it's like, you know, a million white people showing up for Black lives, like one of those people like standing up, not being the hero, like that's okay. But like, if you were a part of that, I mean, I think sometimes can help to visualize, you know, what it could mean to be a part of a bigger thing like that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, let yourself sit in it for a little bit, even meditate on it. I think that can provide some inspiration. And maybe there has to be another event that precedes that, where you've participated in some other thing where you can say, oh, let me put a pin in that memory and remember what it felt like to be a part of something that I wasn't the superhero in. That's what I've had to do consciously to learn the habit of being quiet and standing back when there are other people who should be centered. And it has worked. It actually has worked. Just like maintaining that memory of almost an accidental situation where I wasn't centered, and saying, oh, but this still feels good because I was a part of something.
Yeah. If I can offer a really nerdy comparison that was given to me by some organizers here of an unconference, so this sort of like formatless conference thing, and they use the comparison that like most of the gatherings within that meeting are about, you know, like 20-ish people. So imagine having like a 20-sided die and, you know, like pick a number. So you're one of the sides of the die. If you roll it every time someone talks, like the number of times you would get your number is about how often you should be talking if the conversation is distributed equitably. But yeah, I think it can, it works well for sort of managing like how much you're talking in a meeting. But also I think it can work well for thinking about like, how often is it appropriate for the attention to be on you? You know, because like we live in a culture where like there's always going to be a tendency to single out the individual. Like that force is very powerful, right? You know, Brian and I were co-authors on a paper, right, where one of the authors got asked to speak to the press, and we decided to make it a collective response. And it was sort of like, you know, they were very responsive to that, but they were like, we're not sure, let's go ask the editor. And so like that push towards having an individual voice is very strong, which is why we like pick out these sort of charismatic leaders over and over again. You know, but like Martin Luther King Jr. is not the only person in that movement by a long shot, right?
Yeah.
And so it really bears to remember that, you know, he on his own could not have done that stuff. Like he couldn't have done that without all of the labor of everyone who was there.
And the other thing that that this story reminds me of is like the three of you, or the two of you, and the other co-author, in order to make that change, which who knows the ripple effect it might have, because the journalist now is thinking of it differently, the editor's now thinking of it differently, right? So you can imagine that grows. In order to make that change, you didn't have to boycott the magazine or the newspaper, like never give another press talk again. Like there are in some systems, there are ways to make change just by trying to get people to consider a different way and standing firm in your own beliefs. And I wonder if there are some actions, I'm not saying we should all do the easy stuff that just within our systems, but if there are some actions where if you just examine, is the way this is happening actually achieving my goal? Or if my goal is changing this system, is there a way I can, in every small action, like affect that?
So I believe in I guess in my situations, what's been helpful for changing my behavior habits or just getting started in something is, just starting small with something manageable. So I just started going to city council meetings in my local city in Geneva, Illinois. And then after a while, you start to, even if you sit there with your laptop open and do stuff, you hear stuff, you start learning, and I pay attention, and I noticed that there was no Black History Month, like there are no events in town. And so it's not like I have to go create all of that myself, but maybe I get up to the podium during public comment. I ask the dais an awkward question. And then I go sit back down. I think starting that way, starting with asking questions, you don't have to know everything. You can ask the system questions and poke it a little bit and see how the bear responds. So I think that's another concrete action that people could take, emailing city administrator, emailing people questions, and making the system uncomfortable in simple ways is a way to actually initiate change.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you mean a perfectly reasonable question. What the hell, Geneva? I mean, I know what the hell, but
if people want to hear more about the Geneva situation, there's an interesting one of our later articles from, I think it was sometime in late 2019. You'll see it's one of the last 5 or so posts about a Black History Month event that they tried to pull off, and it was very bad. So
yeah, we should actually.
I try to make it a fun read. I don't know.
We should actually talk about that maybe on our next call, because it's linked in the second issue of the zine. So for people watching this right now who are maybe like out of sync with the month of February or what we're doing, we're talking about our first week zine, which is about voting rights and protest and voting access. But the second week zine is actually also out. And there's a big section in there on listening to Black voices, in which Brian's write-up of the meeting in Geneva plays a central role. But I to sort of return to this idea of like little changes. So I love that idea of asking questions that sort of like push on power structures too. Something that I have implemented, I guess in the past like year or two maybe, is that, like a thing that happens a lot when you're sort of like a white female-ish person in science, is that like you get invited to be on panels or give talks that are about like equity and inclusion in science. And a lot of times those panels are super white. It's like all white women, right? And this has happened with like the undergraduate women in physics conference with like the past 2 years. But it's also, like not just to single them out, because it's happened a number of times with things that I've been invited to. And one of the things that I've realized is that those, responding to those like invitations, if I'm receiving them, is not really just about whether I'm available or not. That something I can do, even if I already know that I am not available, is to ask them about how they have implemented equity, racial equity in their conference. And, like I usually ask, if it's not obvious like who the other panelists are, ask who they have invited, even if they can't put it up publicly because people haven't committed yet. I ask what their philosophy and their approach to curating speakers has been, which is a question that every conference organizer should be able to ask or to answer like right off the bat, like you should have a plan for how you are going to not make your conference completely white people. So, you know, if they can't answer those questions, then that, and I'm available, then that tells me that I should not do those things. And then I suggest other people, usually like women of color, if in that sort of like women in science context. But, you know, those questions are things that I can ask, that I am being offered an opportunity to question the power structure in play. And I bet that for listeners who maybe haven't thought about it this way, there are other situations in which you might be able to ask a question that sort of gets at a larger issue in a meaningful way, maybe.
Yeah, and they don't even, you know, asking a pointed question, like please justify or please explain your, you know, procedures or whatever, is a very great and bold thing to do. But people can ask even more simple and even more obvious questions in smaller situations, right? Where even, you know, when they're not necessarily being asked to do something, just like, hey, how are we making this space accessible? What assumptions are we making about the gender makeup or the racial makeup in this room? And what assumptions are we making in the experiences that people have? I think, like, whenever I think of, you know, graduate student admissions, even if you aren't necessarily looking at individual applications, when you're saying this, just in general, like, what are we baking in from the beginning that is contrary to actually what we want to achieve in terms of equity in our searches? Because it's so often the case that you think you're doing something totally innocent and you realize, oh, I've made this huge assumption.
Can I talk about receipts for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
These questions are a way of gathering receipts, and which helps build up into longer term protest. So if you know what the answer is, or if you don't know to a question, by you asking a question in public or in an email in response to a conference organizer, in response to any scenario, you are actually doing something very productive, which is gathering evidence and receipts of having asked the system how it works, so that later, when you confront the system, when you have this evidence built up, you've done the work. You've done the work of researching how this thing works, and then they can't come back at you and say, well, you're new to this, or you didn't ask questions beforehand, or they can't punt, because you've actually done the work of finding out how things work, and then you have that receipt to share with them. So that's one of the reasons that I think question asking is also just very productive. As you know, in addition to being informative, it gets you stuff for later on when you can put it together.
That's a great point. Yeah, and you know, just like for people who are listening, like, remember I said I started this like a couple of years ago. Like, I didn't always ask the right questions, right? And you know, sometimes when I like have asked questions, people are like, well, you did such and such before and you didn't ask any questions. It's like, yeah, and I should have asked the same questions then, and I didn't. So, you know, like, I want people to remember that, like, question, super simple to ask a question, a little scary maybe, but super simple, right? And, you know, I think that it's something that anyone can start doing anytime. And it doesn't, you know, you don't have to have been doing it right forever. Like, you don't have to get it right the first time either. Like, ideally you'll ask a really like awesome question, but remember that like a lot of this stuff is very unglamorous. You know, it might be small, it might be a start, maybe like your second or third or 20th time that you ask a question will be more contentious than the first. Who knows?
I think one of the things that's so powerful, we've been talking about, one of the reasons why we wanted to start this as BlackLight in the first place 4 years ago, right, was we were tired of people saying like, I'd love to take action, but I don't know enough, as, you know, like a white person ally, which basically was like a get out of jail free card, because people just did no work because they were like, oh, it's too hard, I don't know where to look. And the same thing I think applies, right? If you have started asking questions that are getting these kinds of receipts, and you really want to help other people do the same, then it's possible to say, these are the kinds of questions I ask, like you just mentioned. Like, here's an actual something constructive, and this is what I was looking for. Because I think the only risk that one finds is that people who want to just like push against these power structures, if they're white people, then ask people of color, like, could you please tell me a good question to ask next time I'm in this situation, which is like, oh God, now it's double the work. So we've got to try and remember also to try things. And as you said, you can learn, you can get better at this whole process, but just because it's scary, and just because you're not entirely sure it's going to go the way you expect, doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
Yeah. Especially like if you are a white person who is trying to advocate for, you know, racial justice more broadly, or specifically for justice for Black people, you should expect to feel a little nervous from time to time, or even a lot nervous from time to time. And, you know, like I would encourage people to lean into that feeling, just because it's probably an indication that you are giving up a little bit of your power or making yourself vulnerable. And I think that that's something that gets missed a lot, is that we really have to be willing to do that. You know, like you have to be willing to risk that the conference organizer tells you to piss off and invite someone else.
Yeah.
If they do, big deal. Big deal.
Did you want to go to that conference?
Right.
Right. So yeah, I think it can be scary, but that it's the good kind of scary.
Right. And also the opposite is also true, right? If you want to take action that is, you know, supporting the cause of a group of activists, you know, who are working in some space, or just an individual person, it could be that you have a vision for how this collaboration may work. I think in the Canadian context of Indigenous peoples and collaboration with them, there are a lot of well-meaning white people like me that really want to collaborate in a wide range of spheres. But you can then add this like super white Santa spin on things, and it's not appropriate. And so you have to say, well, even if I have a vision for collaboration in a certain way, if it isn't actually being respectful and understanding the broader context, then it's just my little, you know, idea or my little plan. And so sometimes you need to also realize the sacrifice may have to be waiting. But yeah.
But in the extension, I've learned over the last few years, a little bit longer, you know, how to center Black gender minorities in what they're going through. So I have privilege because I'm you know, I'm a man, I'm Black, but I'm also a man, and I'm not a gender minority. And so you know, there's a complicated web of intersectionality, and if you can find, you know, the space where you know, I'm giving up some comfort. It's a compromise. I'm giving up some comfort because, yeah, there are people who I can support, even though I'm in a position that is vulnerable and requires support as well. And so there's an intersectional scaffolding that's going on, and I think if we remember that, then we can remember that there's value in that discomfort.
Yeah. So cool. I guess we're getting close to the hour. Any final challenging thoughts for this Get Off the Couch Week edition?
That people should start reading week 2. So if you've read week 1 and you're thinking about it, definitely think about like grabbing a friend. You know, you can have, you do not need to film yourself. Like you could just talk to somebody on the phone. You can talk to somebody in person. Grab someone that you want to work through the materials with. Start reading week 2 because it's long. And we're going to do more of these conversations as well. So, you know, if you like this one, come back another time.
You know, we are going to post this video on the blog, and also we're going to, you know, tweet about it. And it would be cool if people are in a meeting, like take a photo, use the hashtag This Is BlackLight, so we can sort of see the collective action and the people that care about this blog, like getting together and making us feel less alone.
Yeah. And if you have questions that you want to raise through the comments on the blog or through social media, you'll see us post, and you're welcome to respond to that.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you guys so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care, y'all. Bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.